Oh. Hi, I'm Marc, an art teacher, a professional artist, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to paint without using a line art. What? It just happens to be my favorite workflow, the one I feel is the most fun because it allows you to get results really quickly. However, it is a little harder than the other workflows that I've shown in previous weeks. So watch at your own risk. Let's see how it's done. Alright, today's tutorial will be a little different than usual in that it's pretty advanced. I'll be trying to explain a very chaotic process as clearly as possible, the process of painting without line art, without a base drawing. Why is it advanced? Because we'll be juggling pretty much every single fundamental there is at the same time. Usually I try to break my workflow into steps that are easily replicable, targeting as few fundamentals at a time as possible, but unless your fundamentals are pretty high up there, you might be disappointed with the result with this method if you try it. And so consider this a requirement to tackle this tutorial, having good-ish fundamentals, that is. I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with my coloring process, starting from a line art. The 2 videos I posted about it did really well, and by the way, you can find them in the top right corner of the screen or down in the description below if you want to watch the process in more details. But the main difference between my process for coloring a drawing and my process to paint without one is simple. The former slowly builds up to the final illustration and we only get a glimpse of the final result, well, at the end. While the latter aims at getting a glimpse of the final result ASAP, rushing through all the steps and relying on a big polishing session at the end to get something we can call final. Painting without line art is great for more experienced artists who want to quickly get ideas on the canvas, or it might actually be easier than drawing if you're coming from a 3D sculpting background, since we'll essentially be sculpting with light and shadows. It's my favorite workflow, but you probably noticed already if you've been a long-time subscriber of the channel. Comment below if you remember when all I was posting here were speed paintings. In any case, back to the tutorial, I still managed to break up my process into steps that you can easily remember, and towards the end of the video I'll also show you some exercise that you can do to eventually paint the way that I'm doing now if you don't think you're quite there yet. For the tutorial, we'll work on something a little simpler than a full illustration, but as you can see here, the process works quite well for that too, and it's quick. So let's see what we'll be reviewing today. 5 steps: composition block out, sculpt with values, add colors, add light, and refine. So the first 4 steps are where things will vary a little bit more. So depending on your style, you might spend a little bit more time on each of those steps, in which case, of course, you won't have as much refining to do at the end. But when it comes to me, I like to rush through the first 4 steps to get a result ASAP, which then I can decide if I want to refine or not. So let's quickly go over these to explain, well, what they're actually about. So the first step here is what I'm working on right now, composition blockouts. So whether you have just a character, like in my case here, or if it's a full painting, like the demo that I did at the beginning of the video, the one thing that you need to keep in mind here at this stage is to only focus on the silhouette. This step basically replaces the sketch that you would normally do, but instead of drawing the contour lines, the outlines, we're going right into the flats, sculpting the outline until we get something that we like. Now, obviously, since there are no construction lines, that's where it becomes a little bit tricky because you need to have those things in your head already. But yeah, once again, only focusing on the silhouettes. And for this stage, I like to keep it in grayscale so that I'm not distracted with anything else. I can 100% focus on the composition. By the way, all those fundamentals that I'm talking about, things like the composition, values, colors and lights, anatomy. If you want to learn more about those and really get a good idea of all the things that you should really start to learn or really focus your studies on, if you want to become a good artist, you can find a link to a video that I did 2 weeks ago talking about that exact topic. So link in the top right corner and down below. So composition's done. Once we're happy with the silhouettes, we can move on to sculpting those flat shapes with values. Here what I like to do is to start with a fairly light flat color so that I can add shadows on there. So at this stage, I'm not really focusing on the highlights. It's really more just the shadows. So things like the shadows around the eye socket to position where the eyes are going to go. Some shadows under some big muscle groups to hint at their volumes. And well, basically here, all I'm talking about is just shading. But it's not like shading a drawing because we don't have lines to go by. So we're kind of making up the details as we go, which is a little bit harder. And then if you're asking, yes, I also have a tutorial about shading. Link down below. All right, so now I've been focusing on values for the most part and medium-sized details only. So we started with big details, silhouettes. Now we're working on medium-sized details, and that's really where we're going to leave it for now. But when it comes to the colors here, what I like to do is just create a selection of my silhouette and then bring up the control balance tool, Control B in Photoshop, and basically just tint my grayscale. Now it's not going to give us the best color, but that's fine because this is supposed to be the unlit version of the character or the scene or the environment, whatever it is that you're painting. So don't worry if it's a little bit dark. We don't want to make things too bright because keep in mind, once again, step number 4, we're going to be adding some lights. But before we do it, let's do a quick recap of what we've seen so far. So we start with a composition, basically just simple silhouettes of everything that you're going to have in your canvas. Then it's shading time or light sculpting time. And then here you want to figure out as much as possible the medium-sized details within your shapes. So, you know, think about the main shapes for the armor parts, for example. All of this, you'll want to figure that out at this stage so that when we move on to colors, with the help of new selections, we'll be able to kind of finalize the overall look of our image. Now, of course, this still doesn't look too sexy, very rough, but for these characters, I have pretty much everything that I need. At this point, what we should have is a drawing that looks pretty good seen as a thumbnail. At this size, anyways, we can't pick up any details, so it's really all about the bigger shapes and the overall read of the image. Now, I like what I see here, so let's keep going. And let's slap some lights on here. Now, before I added the lights, you can see I have 3 different layers here, but really, I only saved the 3 layers so that I could show you the different stages. But in my document, I only had a single layer at this point. So you might prefer to have the grayscale on its own layer and then to have the colors on a separate layer. But in my case, I go through the first 4 steps so quickly and my drawing is so rough that it just makes more sense to leave it all on the same layer. Keep things simple, but that is going to change when we get to the lights. So for lights, as you can see here, I have separate layers, and then my layers are set to overlay mode. Overlay mode is not the best for highlights, but it is the best that I found. Some other blending modes will be either too dim or others will be too intense for my tastes. But with overlay, you can get some pretty nice highlights. And if you need to, just like I did here, to reinforce some of those highlights even more, like you can look at the hair, very subtle, but you can always just duplicate the layer, get a more intense highlight. Now, when it comes to my light setup here, I have my first light, my key light, the most intense of them all. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and consider that this is the light of the sun. So coming from the top and slightly behind the character. And then if you're going to have multiple light sources, which I recommend, normally I'll go for 3. So I'm going to have the main lights. I'm going to have some sort of bounce light coming from an opposite direction, and then some ambient light. And you can think of like the light of the sky. So like a subtle blue tint coming from the top as well. So very quickly, something like this. And as you can notice, I decided to hide my first light, which I do recommend doing as well. Whenever you work on a new light source, hide the other one so that they don't distract you. And if you're wondering how to actually paint the light, how to actually color your drawings, with which colors to choose, well, I do have tutorials for that as well. So once again, check the links in the description. Now, I could add a 3rd light source, but I'm going to keep it at 2 for now. And now, so there should be very little difference between the final image and this image right now at this stage when we look at them at this size, which in my opinion is the beauty of this workflow, because I was able to get something that looks final, well, at least at this size, extremely quickly. It really didn't take me long to get to this stage, and it would have been a lot longer if I spent my time carefully working on each of the different steps. Now, granted, I'm left with a sketchy mess if I zoom in, but that's fine. Now I can decide, looking at the final-ish product, or at least a really good glimpse at what the final will be, if I want to commit further, or if I'm just going to trash it. Of course, in my case, I'm going to keep going and we're going to refine this a little bit. I'm going to flatten everything that I've done so far. So Control J to duplicate it, and then Control E to merge it. Then I'm going to group everything else that I've done so far and save it as a backup here, so that I can always go back if something goes terribly wrong. But right now I'm left with one layer, and now I'm ready to just move on to the final polish. So in my case, obviously this is going to be the stage that takes the longest because I've rushed through the first 4 steps, but that's fine. That's the easy part. The composition, the idea, the lighting, the shading, all of that is what I consider to be the hardest. And so I always try to get it out of the way at the beginning, essentially trying to get all the main pieces of this illustration to fit together from the start. And then I'm pretty much guaranteed to have something that looks good after I'm done with all the polishing because my base is good. Now, refining. What does that mean? To add polish, to refine. It's a question I get a lot. How do you make your paintings look final? Well, it's all in your treatment of materials. So right now, everything looks kind of the same, right? All of my surfaces have this kind of matte, plasticky feel, which doesn't look too good. And so when I talk about refining and polish, all I mean here is just defining those materials better, playing with the level of glossiness for certain materials and the level of reflection. And basically a combination of those two things here, glossiness and reflections, will allow me to create pretty much any material that I want. So for metals, it'll be very glossy, at least shiny metals, very glossy and very reflective. If those two values are maxed out, that would be the same as like a chrome ball. And if I want to have like a texture of a rock, it will be not glossy at all and not reflective, so it'll be the complete opposite. And then let's say I want some sort of plastic, maybe. Plastic will be a little bit reflective and very glossy, maybe, if it's shiny plastic. So yeah, each materials have their own parameters, characteristics, but it usually revolves around glossiness and reflectivity. And I could make an entire tutorial on materials alone because there's a lot to cover. And well, wait a second, I actually did. Yay! So on the top right corner of the screen here, you'll find a link to my tutorial talking about properties of materials. But yeah, when it comes to polishing, of course, it's going to be also in the small details of the illustration. We've worked on big details so far, medium-sized details, but not the smaller details yet. And smaller details would be like seams, like tiny folds, maybe like paint chips on the surface of the armor, maybe like little straps, some belts, all the smaller accessories. Basically the stuff that you would notice at, well, this scale. Stuff that you would not notice at this scale. Alright, now regarding the steps that I take for the polish phase, usually I'll always start with the details, making sure that I get those smaller details in there first, and then focus on the materials, as you saw. And so I'm going to stop right here. I mean, this thing is still extremely sketchy, but if we zoom out a little bit, it looks a little bit more polished. And I just want to mention also, it wasn't a tutorial on design, so apologies for the really uninspired design here, but that is the process. Now, I did mention exercises at the beginning of the video, and here they are. So I think there are 3 levels that would make sense. So basically, you know, if you've never done this before, I would start with level 1 and then make your way from there. So the level 1 here would be very similar to what I did at the beginning of the video, using a photo as a starting point. But in this case, for the level 1, instead I would recommend that you make very little change to the image. So find a photo that matches very closely what you want to achieve. Let's say you're drawing a medieval character, wearing a cool armor and a cool sword. But try to find something like that and then paint over it, but not changing completely the character. Instead, just making minor modifications, making sure that you maintain the same kind of light setup, light direction, same color, same values, etc. Level 2 would be exactly like I did at the beginning of the video, the short painting video that I showed. So once again, you would start from a photo, but this time you only use the photo as a source to color pick from, with the end result being something completely different. And then if you ever feel up to it, level 3 would be starting from scratch. So basically what I did here with these characters. Have fun. Now I will say that this one here is very, very fun. Highly recommend that you try it. But yeah, there we go. This is going to wrap up this tutorial. Once again, this is a workflow that I really, really enjoy. I find it a lot more freeing as an artist versus starting from a line art. I mean, it's all fun, but I prefer this method. And so yeah, if you feel up to it, give it a shot. I would love to see what you make. If you end up creating something cool as a result of, you know, the tutorials or the free brushes that I offer. By the way, you'll find a link to my brushes for free down in the description below. Use them responsibly. I hope you liked the tutorial. If you did, you know what to do. Tell your friends about my channel. I crank out new art videos like this every single Friday. You better tell them. It's the law. And if you found the video helpful or entertaining, destroy that like button and come back next week for another video tutorial.